All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to our session. I hope everyone's excited to look at how to move their score up a bit. I'm going to say some things that might not be expected for the topic, but I hope you'll find them helpful. Let me put this up here. So our topic today is the difference between a 700 and a 750. This, of course, is a very ambitious topic to have because, of course, 700 already is a lovely score to have, and many of my students would be delighted to reach that point. So I'm guessing some of you are still working on that part and would like to eventually get a 750. Some of you may be lucky enough to already have hit that 700 plus mark and are looking to get that next notch up. So I want to talk to you about what things are involved in doing that. I'm curious about people's experience so far. So if you could just go into the chat and just type in a letter in the comments. You can also add in any other explanatory text you want, but I'm just curious where you are in the study process. Have you already taken the test? Are you just getting started? Are you anywhere in between? So just give me your ranking of how far along in the process are you? Love to see people's experience, people's background in the comments. Okay, a lot of test veterans I see. Okay. And then some beginners. Okay, but a lot of you have taken the real GMAT before. Okay. All right, so I'm talking to some veterans here. I'll keep that in mind. So I want to talk about a few things today relative to getting that score up to a very high level. I think there are a lot of misconceptions, and I want to start by addressing some of those misconceptions. We'll even say sometimes, scoring at the 750 level to reach the 750 level. But we want to think about the idea of level differently than the way we might think about it, say, academically, right? If you think about learning math in school, there are levels of math. And even though they're not really one on top of the other, right? There are parts of calculus that might be easier than parts of algebra, et cetera. We still generally take them in a clear sequence. And if you hadn't taken algebra yet, you wouldn't enroll in calculus, for instance, right? So there can be this idea that at 750, there's this very high level that we're supposed to have reached, that we study our way up to step by step by step. And that's not entirely wrong, but it's not entirely right either. I think it's important to realize that the GMAT material doesn't change much level by level. And even if you're scoring something very low, at 250, you're going to see problems that involve some tricky skills in the same areas that you'll see in the rest of the test: algebra, geometry, statistics, grammar, logic, all the things that the test tests. They don't really change much level by level. What tends to change is how they put them together and how much you're expected to notice. And so what we're really going to look at today is, how do I take those same skills that I use on easier questions and put them to play so that I can get very consistent on hard questions. Another misconception I think people have about scoring at the 750 level is the balance that quant and verbal have to play in that. Right? And they're very different tests, the quant section and the verbal section. And we want to think about how those differences play out when we're testing. So I'm curious, what % of your study time do you spend on the quant section of the test? Just curious, give me a %. What % of your study time so far do you put into quant? Okay. Seen a range, yeah. Oh yeah, I'm getting a better feel for who I'm working with. This is cool. So I saw that some of you already have hit these 700 plus scores, which is wonderful. And then I'm seeing a lot of folks saying, "Hey, I don't spend that much time on quant." Right? There's a range here. I would like to have a lot of you consider how that relates to your score goals. Now, obviously, if I sat down with each of you individually, I might see your individual quant and verbal scores and see how that works out for you in particular. Generally, what I caution people to do is look at their actual scores, not the percentiles. So you'll know that you have that score range from 6 to 51, and you have a percentile that corresponds to that. But the percentiles are very out of whack with the scores, it seems, right? Someone who gets, say, a 720 with a 45 quant, 45 verbal is at the 99th percentile in verbal and about the 54th percentile in quant. So it's a very strange disconnect between the sections. And it has to do with the fact that the people who take the GMAT tend to be very strong in quant. And you may be one of those people that's already doing, that quant 46, 47, 50 range. And in that case, spending more time on your verbal is very much justified. What's interesting is that I see people scoring at those high levels who are still spending 70, 80% of their time on the quant section. And I think that's a huge mistake. One of the things you have to keep in mind is that to get a 750, you have to have a high verbal score. There's just not much of a way around that, right? And that's something that I think a lot of people don't recognize. They think of the test as being simply about doing as well as possible, but they don't think about the limitations that this algorithm is going to place on you if you only max out one side of the test. So if you have ever seen our score calculator, you can see the combinations that will get you to a 750. And the bidding starts at 41 verbal, right? Even if you have a perfect quant score, you need a 41 verbal to get to a 750. And there is some rounding here, right? So these are all plus or minus about 10 points. Assuming that you don't want to rely on getting a perfect quant score, nice as that is, you need to get your verbal score up into the 40s. And the difference between getting a verbal in the 40s, like a 42 or a 44, yes, there really is no such thing as a verbal 43. It's strange. The difference between getting a verbal score at that level and getting a quant score at that level is that in verbal, you just can't get that many wrong. So basically, I always tell people who are shooting for even a 700 plus that you need to get your verbal misses down to single digits. And that's not necessarily true of quant, although it becomes so near the very top. You'll start to see people missing in quant 9, 6, 5, 2 at the very, very top. But that happens faster in verbal. So even in the mid to low 40s, you might find that you're only missing a handful of questions. So getting very accurate in verbal is another thing. And that's not about learning any terribly advanced skills. If you know how to get a 700, you know how to get a 750 in terms of the content. The content doesn't change that much. It's more how you put it together. So I want to look at a couple of examples of that just to make sure that we're all clear. Let me know if you have questions about anything we've covered so far. Otherwise, I'll move ahead. Okay. Mm-hmm. So I want to look at a couple questions and think about how we use those to build up our study process. So I'll start with a verbal question that many people find fairly hard. It's one that we wrote, although it has a lot of the features that we see in harder official sentence correction questions. So it's not in the official guide, but you may have seen it before if you're a GMAT club stalwart who sees a lot of questions. But let's see what we can do with this. So I'll give you about a minute and 20 to try this out. And then when I say go, you can start putting your answers into the comments and we'll see where you are. So take about a minute and 20 to try this. Okay, let's have those answers. If you're not sure, give us your best guess at this point. I'll encourage you to guess in this way. So far, no one has gotten this one. So if you guess, you might be the first one to get it right. Okay, there we go. We have a winner. So this is a hard question, right? One of the things that makes it very hard is just there's so much underlined, and a lot of people find that overwhelming. What am I supposed to do with all this material? Having the whole thing underlined doesn't automatically make it hard, as long as you can see, proper differences to make some eliminations on. But sometimes when you see a lot underlined, the test authors have a chance to reorganize the sentence a lot, and that can make it harder if you have to keep looking at the sentence from different angles. So what I see very commonly with sentence correction is that people have studied very hard. They've learned a lot of rules. They've learned idioms. They've learned parallelism. They are looking for pronoun differences. They've just got a million things that they've studied. Maybe they've been through our entire sentence correction curriculum or someone else's. Maybe they spent a lot of time in discussion on GMAT Club, asking for help, going through. And I see a lot of you doing that. I think where people get a little lost on sentence correction is that they don't know how to start. Right? They don't know how to start. They just sort of look and go, okay, examples of a term. Okay, one says a term coined, and one says coined examples. And then this includes examples. And okay, let's see. Some of them say and as well as. There's just so much to look at. And I think it's very easy to get lost in that process. So I want to suggest that a top scorer has a very, very consistent process. If I'm saying you can only afford to miss a handful of questions, that means that you can't leave it to chance. Because let's say you're pretty comfortable, you're pretty sure you're right. Maybe you are right about a particular sentence, say 90% of the time. But if you keep looking at these as individual sentences, you can do the probability here, right? If I have a 90% chance, say, of seeing this as has an error, what happens when you multiply that out in 5 answer choices? And then let's say you do that over a next question and a next question, next question. That 90% accuracy turns into something much lower as you start to realize that you're not able to tell for sure how good these sentences are. So we need something that's a bit more reliable. And so what I tend to have people do is to get very comfortable stripping every single sentence down to its core. And to do this consistently and to do it first. Before you worry about meaning, before you worry about all the little differences in wording, what is the basic core of the sentence? And this is part of the process that a lot of us do anyway, which is to find some kind of split in the sentences, in the answer choices. But I want you to do this specifically using the sentence core. So if we have that, we want to see the subject and the verb and any other major parts of the sentence structure and ignore modifiers. So if we think about this, what is the subject of our sentence? What is the noun that's doing the action in the sentence? Oh, sorry. Let me put this up better. Yeah, I'll leave it like this for now. Yeah, so we want to have examples, right? And then we have a modifier of tulipomania. Any prepositional phrase of, in, for, by, from, etc. Modifier, cut it out, right? And then we have comma, a term. That's in a positive modifier. It's modifying tulipomania, right? So where is the verb for examples? What are the examples doing? Okay, examples include. All right, and then we'll always include the object of whatever our verb is. So we'd have to say examples include bubbles. And then we have to think about how the list continues if there's a list, right? We see bubbles in South Sea trading rights, Victorian real estate, the US stock market, and the obsession for Beanie Babies. So there are a couple of ways that we can read this, but we would see it something like this, right? Examples of telomania include speculative bubbles in, and then there's a list of these items that seem to apply to this phrase here. So then the question is, are we trying to say, we have to get into a bit of meaning here. Are we trying to say that all of these things had bubbles? There were bubbles in South Sea trading rights. There were bubbles in Victorian real estate. There were bubbles in the obsession for Beanie Babies. Or was bubbles just the first thing on the list? And then Victorian real estate is the second thing, etc. So any ideas? How do we tell? Are all of these things supposed to be bubbles? What I'll often do is I'll try to cut that phrase out and see if I can apply it separately to all the items, or if I can treat it as attached to one piece. So if I look at it as bubbles in South Sea trading rights, then I'd have to say the second thing would be Victorian real estate. Can Victorian real estate be an example of this kind of craze they're talking about by itself? The U.S. stock market, well, is the U.S. stock market itself an example of this this craze? It's tricky because, of course, we probably haven't heard of tulipomania before. I've only heard of it because I've done this question before. I used as a term. But it seems like the bubbles are all these things, and then someone's saying, okay, it's the first three. Yeah, that's interesting, right? So we have bubbles in South Sea trading rights, Victorian real estate, the U.S. stock market, and wait, the obsession for Beanie Babies. So the first three things are all basically markets or realms in which these bubbles occurred. And then the fourth thing is an obsession. It's not a realm, it's another kind of craze. So it almost seems like the fourth thing has to be different. But if we look back at how the sentence is written, they haven't given us that option because that word obsession is not underlined. So we have to find some way to fix this, where we can have the obsession somehow be separate from the others. Can you see any way to do that in the answer choices? Do any of the answer choices give us a way out of this? Okay. So the as well as in B and C is very interesting. And by itself, as well as is not really much more interesting than and. But there's an extra piece that the as well as choices have. And in some ways, it's more important than saying as well as. If we look at A, which, sorry, has got to be out, and then I look at how that connects to the others, we can see that in all of these answers, we've got bubbles in this, and the obsession. And so by itself, as well as is not particularly different. Sorry, D did something funny. It's closing the list. Yeah, it's the and that closes out that list. So we're down to B and C on just that one issue. If you look at how B and C are written, they say bubbles in South Sea trading rights, Victorian real estate, and the US stock market, as well as this. If they wanted to, they could simply have said and instead of as well as. So a lot of people will look at something idiomatic like this. Oh, I'm supposed to take note of the words as well as are very important. The words as well as are not very important. They're not. What's important is that we closed out that list beforehand. So the as well as was a clue maybe to look somewhere. What's going on? Why are they saying it that way? We don't normally end a list with as well as. Well, we didn't end the list with it. We ended it with and. And that enabled us to move on. We could have said something else. So what we end up with is just looking at the parallel elements here and making sure they're parallel. We got rid of 3. And this is part of what I think of as essential to the sentence core, is that when you have a subject and a verb and an object, and the object is complicated, you'll often get parallel structure. You'll often get a list with commas and, for instance. And you want to make sure that the items in that list all are meant to go together. So that right there would get us down to 2. And a lot of people might be able to do that, but I think what a 750 scorer is able to do is do that very quickly and efficiently. And this is something with both quant and verbal that people underestimate. They underestimate how important it is not just to be right, but to have certain parts that go very automatically. And it's much more important to master the basics that kind of everyone learns at a high level where you're doing them without too much pain and suffering than it is to look for the small little cases, the once in a blue moon random expressions. Those are nice and those can pick you up a point. If you look at, I don't know if any of you have this beast, the Advanced Official Guide. This sentence correction in this book drives me crazy because often the right answer will be, it'll use some little turn of phrase that you thought was wrong, but actually it's okay. And that's nice. You can study those things if you want. But I think so much of doing well on this, people underestimate the importance of just having the basics at a very high level where you're very fast and very consistent, where you look at this list and say, oh, it's this. And you almost x-ray through to the core. You ignore the part about the term coined or coined from and all that. You just ignore that for now. And you look at the underlying structure of the sentence and you do it every single time. And I've seen people go from missing most of sentence correction to almost never missing sentence correction just by getting really consistent in how they apply the core before they go in and look at modifiers and meaning in the remaining choices, which is what we're going to do now, right? So we've narrowed it down to 2. We've already gotten rid of most of the answers that people chose. As I said at the beginning, no one had gotten this right. It's a hard problem, but we can still use the underlying core and sentence structure to get there. At that point, we have 2 options. We can simply look at differences between the remaining 2 choices, or we can look at individual parts as we go along through each. And I tend to actually like to read more horizontally than vertically. I think a lot of people get used to looking at the splits vertically. One starts with examples, one starts with coined from, but by itself, there's no right or wrong answer to that. So I can't just decide. Instead, I want to look at internally and make sure that the sentence makes sense consistently. So if I look at B, I'll say, okay, examples of tulipomania. All right, and then I have a comma modifier. Okay, a term coined from the, okay, a term is applying to tulipomania. That seems okay. Include, and then I have the part that I've done, speculative bubbles and this, and this. So then I look at C and say, well, what's really any different? A lot of it's the same. The underlying core is basically the same. So then I'll say coined from 17th century tulip craze in the Netherlands. Examples of tulipomania include, okay, What's the difference between those 2? What makes those different? That may sound like a funny question. Well, what's the difference? Well, one says example, the term coined, and the other says coined. But how are those any different for each other? In other words, if at the end I have to be able to say one of these is correct and one of these is incorrect, how would I do that? It seems like either could be fine, but somehow they're not. Interesting. Yeah, Pradeep says you don't coin examples. I think that's well said. Yeah, the modifier is misplaced. Yes, exactly. So if I look at B, a term coined from is right next to tulipomania. It's right next to the thing it's modifying. And you've probably learned with noun modifiers, and if you haven't learned this, this is one of the central things to know about modifiers, that they tend to modify what's right next to them. There are some weird exceptions, and there are cases where what's right next to them has to be defined very carefully. But the basic idea is that if I say coined from, whatever comes next is what was coined. And so what we see in C is that it's saying that examples were coined from the tulip craze. And an example can't be coined. Coined is another funny phrase, but although even if you had never used that particular term before, the way you see a term coined from in A and B, that's another clue. There's a clarifying noun there, a term that is missing in C, D, and E, and it's not a required word. We can certainly take the word term out. I'll see sometimes people in the forums will say, oh, I don't like D or this or that because it changes the meaning. And I have to be very careful about that, because what is the meaning, right? That we've already seen that A is wrong. So it's okay to quote unquote change the meaning. We're just looking for a meaning that's clear, a meaning that makes sense. And if you look at B, it's clearly saying that the term is coined. And so we need to apply our modifier to the term. C is applying our modifier to examples. Examples cannot be coined. And for that reason, we have to get rid of C. Okay, so tough problem. If you got B, give yourself a pat on the back, even if you guessed. It's important to guess. And I think that's an underappreciated skill, that even at the very top, I'm still working on that 800. I've never quite scored 800, but my colleagues who have said still, yeah, there was some luck involved. There were a few guesses, right? So that never goes away. I wish it did. I wish I could say every time I see a GMAT problem, I know instantly what it should be and I do it correctly and I'm always right. I would love to say that. I would be lying, right? So we're going to be doing some guessing. So if you guessed right, give yourself applause. If you figured it all out in the time allotted, give yourself some applause too. But I hope we're able to see, as we'll see again in math in just a minute, that on a hard verbal question, it really comes down to simply applying a couple of things that you know already. So a couple of things that you want to know about sentence correction as a whole would be how to find the core, how to deal with parallelism and parallel lists, and our rules about noun modifiers. And from those pieces alone, you can get to the answer. Okay. So I think that's incredibly important to get comfortable with as you proceed on this. And if you're trying to get to a level where you're hitting a 750 plus, you just can't miss many, right? And so that's where you want to get. You want to get to the point where you're very consistent. And a lot of people think of that as a given thing, right? So I'm one of those spoiled people or whatever for whom sentence correction came nicely and easily. I have the background for it, I guess you could say. Like I grew up, my dad was an English professor, and then I was an English major, right? Lots of reading and writing and English literature and all those things. That certainly makes it easier. But I'll have students who do not have that background who get very consistent with sentence correction. I've seen a lot of people from whatever their background able to learn these skills and put them together. So a quick summary. Someone was asking what makes the wrong answers wrong again. So quick summary, and you might want to kind of rehearse this in your head too, see if you could explain it. If this were class, I'd get one of you on the microphone right now and just have you do it, right? So the quick summary is that A, D, and E are all wrong because they don't end the list of things that had bubbles before they go to the obsession with Beanie Babies. So A, D, and E all say bubbles in South Seas trading rights, Victorian real estate, the stock market, and the obsession. That immediately makes A, D, and E wrong. B and C are better because they close that list out. They say bubbles in South Sea trading rights, Victorian real estate, and the US stock market. Then they say, as well as the obsession for Beanie Babies. Then we get rid of C because it says examples were coined from something. That can't be right. The term was coined, and that gets us to B. Okay. So that's very important. I had a question earlier. Someone said, "Hey, can you give me suggestions on pacing?" And I'm not going to get into detail on pacing today. On our blog, we have a whole rundown on how to time yourself on the test. I recommend that you check that out. And there are lots of methods out there. The basic idea is to have a set of benchmarks and stick to them. So whether you use our method, someone else's method, I don't care. What I want you to make sure you do is you make sure you're staying on time. You have a breakdown of how many questions you should do in how many minutes. The rough guideline would be that every 9 minutes on verbal, you're getting through 5 questions. Every 10 minutes in quant, you're getting through 5 questions, roughly speaking. And that you want to privilege being on time above and beyond being right. Now, if you're going to get a 750, you kind of need both. You need to be on time and right. But if you have to choose being on time so you don't crash at the end. But a big part of getting faster is not simply reading faster, enlarging our brain, all those things. It's simply doing the routine, easier things in a very routine, easy manner so that you can get down to thinking about something like B versus C rather quickly rather than struggling about it. Okay. Questions on that one before we move on and talk about how to apply this to quant? The question was, is the speculative bubbles in the root phrase of B? Yes, that's right. What we have is we have a root phrase for a list, and because we have that speculative bubbles in, and then all these things are modifying it, we need to close that list before we move on to talking about the obsession. Question, hey, this takes a lot of time. How do I identify the core and issues faster? I think it's very important to practice this very consistently. In our notes here, we have something funny. So I'll suggest that you can do this, but you might make some adjustments here. But we always look for how to build flashcards that you can literally make flashcards of these things of, hey, well, next time I see this, what am I going to do? And so our note here is that when you see most of the sentence underlined, you want to find the core. But honestly, what I recommend is even further than that. This is a note someone might make, and I would agree with them, but I would recommend that you actually just find the core every time. And one thing I think is very important is that you follow up by doing untimed review every time you do a problem. So I think it's very important that we get in the habit of doing all of our work timed, especially if you're not brand new. For those of you who are brand new, it's okay when you're learning a topic to sort of slow down and take the time to understand it in detail. But once you're at least a few weeks into study, and once you're dealing with topics that you've seen before, I think it's very important to do all of your work timed. But I always recommend that you do your work, you review your work untimed. And I think the best way and the best time to do that is to review your work before you've even seen whether you're right or wrong. In other words, take a set of say sentence correction problems that you're working on, and the target time on sentence correction is 1 minute and 20. That would mean 3 sentence corrections should take you 4 minutes. Give yourself 4 minutes per 3. So you could do 6 and 8 minutes or whatever you want. You don't need to do long sets. That's what practice tests are for. No hurry to do that. But maybe do a set of 3 or 6, something like that. Have that timed experience. Then don't even check your answers. Don't even find out whether you're right or wrong. Go back through untimed and do the kind of stuff we just did. Okay, maybe underline. Maybe do. Maybe you have a printed out copy, or maybe you're working on a hard copy. Or you can write up notes on the side. If you have an official guide, you might not want to write in your official guide. In fact, I recommend that you don't. But write some notes. What's exactly wrong with every choice? What are the other issues that you didn't use? Tear the thing apart. But get really consistent at looking for the sentence core up front and then analyzing and making sure you have it on the back end. And over time, it gets faster and faster to see. You start to notice more things. So that's what I recommend. There's no quick shortcut, but it is something that I see people get better with practice over the course of say, a month or more. If you're taking the test a week from now, don't even try to change that. But if you're taking the test a little further out, then you have time to just practice this daily until it becomes more natural. So you can look for other issues and build cards out of that. If you see the and in the beginning or end of an underline, or if you see there's a split in the use of ands, you might think about what and is connecting. And is such a basic word, right? It doesn't seem important, but we have this list, and often you'll see issues with closing out lists. And that connects to, someone was asking why we have a comma before as well as, because we've ended one list and we're moving on to something else. And so this is normally what you do. You would separate that out. So the question was, do you generally start with breaking down the sentence into its simple structure, then go from there? Yes. Do it really consistently. And there are times where you might bypass this because something jumps out as very obvious. If I'm at the beginning of the sentence and it says something like my parents, university, and you go, wait, you like my parents, university? That doesn't sound right. I think I should be comparing my parents to me, or I should be comparing university to, to my earlier school experience, something like that. So in those cases, you might get rid of that immediately and never even read the rest of the sentence. And that's okay. If the sentence is wrong, it's wrong. But assuming you don't see something like that, I would go straight to the core. And what you start to develop sort of what you might think of as X-ray eyes. You start to look through a sentence and you just say, okay, I don't need that. So I'm looking at this one going, examples of include bubbles. I'm seeing that. I'm barely reading those other words. I'm seeing the subject examples and I'm looking examples what? What are the examples doing? Then you're going to notice the nicest ones to notice then are the ones that aren't sentences at all. Sometimes you'll see a choice that doesn't even have a verb for the subject. It has a verb somewhere in there, but the verb doesn't apply to that subject. It's part of a modifier. And in those cases, you can almost laugh that question off. Oh, of course, that answer is impossible. But often the core will be pretty good in some or all of the answers, most or all. And so we then have to just identify other issues. But seeing the core first allows you to then apply the modifiers on. I think of the modifiers as peripherals that you're plugging into your machine. Right. Okay, I have a monitor and I have an external hard drive, things that I'm attaching, but do they work? Do they correctly attach to my machine? So I'm looking at that underlying machine and making sure that it's functioning well. And then I'm looking at the modifiers and seeing how they plug into it. Okay. All right. So let's move to quant and talk about some of the same ideas. I have a different take on quant today. So I'm going to give you an annoying Hey everybody. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there, but let's give this another shot. Okay, so what I was going to do is I'm going to toss a data sufficiency problem at you and give you some time to work it. You can put your answer in whenever you're ready. And let's do it. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of folks have answered, so we'll go ahead and talk about this. But I'm not going to talk about this one right away, so I'll hold you in suspense about whether you got it right, unless you've seen this before and know it, which you may. Um, I know sometimes I run into students who have seen basically everything, and although that's wonderful in your dedication, I sometimes do think that's a diagnostic sign of trouble. And what I mean by that is if you've seen all the GMAT problems, if you've seen everything out there, and you don't and you're not done, if you haven't moved on and gotten your score and gotten into business school, maybe you're not studying thoroughly enough. And I think that's one of the more common mistakes is people do quantity over quality. Back when I could still go to the gym, right? We're going to wait a while before we go back to the gym. I would see people who would go to the gym and they'd be there for a long time, but they're not always getting as much done as they'd like. Whether it's they have the weights on the lightest setting and they're just kind of doing this, or they're relaxing on their phone, at the weight machine. I think sometimes we want to put in a lot of hours and we want to see a lot of problems, but we don't always get enough out of them. And so partly what I want to do is make sure that I'm looking at a problem and saying, what are the pieces that that make this difficult? Where's the challenge come from? And I think there are several challenges in this problem. The other thing is we don't want to obsess on the hardest problems. Sometimes I'll have a tutoring session and I'll meet with a student and they'll say, oh, I know we were going to go over this and this and this today, but I took a practice test recently and there were some really hard problems that I want to go over. And I understand that. And it's their time. If they want to go over the really hard problems, they can. But my interest in someone's test, what do I want to go over the most? The problems that were the easiest. The problems that they missed that were the easiest. And they might not want to do that because they might not need my help to go over those. They look and say, oh, well, yes, I just accidentally said 25 instead of 26 or, something like that. And certainly there's a lot that one can learn by themselves without a tutor. But I think people over obsess on the absolute hardest problems that they might miss anyway, that they might miss even if they spent 3-4 minutes on, instead of saying, how do I make sure that the problems that do test things I already know, I'd get right? How do I make sure I have that? And so if you look at this problem and and you're stumped by several things in it, then long term you might get this right. Short term, you might just want to recognize that it's testing something you don't know how to do and get out of there. And that can be a valuable thing to do even at the 750 level. But let's break down some of the challenges in this problem a few ways by looking at some variations. So what if I looked at a problem like this instead? Notice that this has a lot in common with the last problem. Let me actually pop this back up again. So the initial question said, does integer k have a factor p such that 1 is less than p is less than k? Now this one says, can k be expressed as a product of two integers, each of which is greater than 1? Okay. Now let me go to a problem that even might be, slightly easier than that. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop share and I go to this version. Here's another question asking the same kind of thing. Let me put this one up. If a, b, and c are positive integers and a plus b is c, does c have more than one factor greater than 1? So let me ask you this. All of these questions were actually asking the same thing in different variations. What are they asking about? What are all of these three questions that we just looked at about? In other words, what does it mean to ask, in this case, does c have more than one factor greater than 1? Yeah, so what we want to recognize across a lot of these is that we're looking at prime numbers. And specifically, the question, yeah, well said, right? The question is really technically asking, is C a composite number? Is C a non-prime greater than 1? Right? So if C is 4 or 6 or something like that, then yes, it has more than one factor greater than 1. If it's a prime or if it's 1, then no. right? Right. Um, so that's what we're looking for. And the statements are going to give us some relevance on that, right? So statement 1 here says A is a multiple of 3. Can we tell from that whether the C term is prime or composite? No, we can't tell, right? Even if statement 1 were about C, we still wouldn't know whether it was prime or composite, because if it's a multiple of 3, it could be 3, in which case it's prime, or it could be any of the multiples of 3, the positive multiples, 6, 9, 12, etc. Of course, none of which are prime because they're multiples of 3. Add to that we're adding B to it, we don't know. If A is 3, for instance, we could add 1 to get 4, which is composite, or we could add 2 to get 5, which is prime. So statement 1's insufficient, which means we can get rid of A and D, right? If you haven't learned this, I always write AD, BCE. If statement 1 is insufficient, I cross off AD. If it's sufficient, I keep those two. Then if I put statement 2 in there, B is a multiple of 6, you can see the same thing. The difference, of course, if we're just looking at B and we know it's a multiple of 6, we know it's composite. It can't be prime because 6 isn't prime, and any multiple of 6 then will be built out of pieces. But we're not just talking about B. We could add 1 to 6 and get 7, which is prime. We could add 2 to 6 and get 8, which is composite, right? So statement 2 is not sufficient either. And a lot of you are telling me now, yeah, the answer is C, right? What 1 and 2 together tell us is that we're adding 2 multiples of 3. The 6 is kind of a trick, right? If I add 2 multiples of 3, I'll always get another multiple of 3, but it won't simply be 3. It'll be some larger multiple of 3, and therefore it's a composite number. If that wasn't obvious to you in theory terms, you could get there from picking numbers. You could just try some multiples of 3 and 6, and no matter what you do, you'll keep getting composite numbers. And what I always do is I say, look, I'm going to call something insufficient if I can prove it. If I can find a yes and a no, or if I can find 2 different values if it's a value question. If I can't prove it, if I keep getting the same result over and over again, I'm going to have to say it's sufficient at some point. So our answer here is C, right? C, not E, C. The 2 statements work together because if each of these makes a multiple of 3, you put them together, C then is also a multiple of 3. But it's not 3 itself, right? So if you think about it, since these are positive numbers, the smallest combo we could have would be 3 plus 6 is 9. We could then have bigger multiples of 3, bigger multiples of 6. I could do 6 plus 6 is 12, or 6 plus 12 is 18, or 9 plus 6 is 15. No matter what I do, it's not going to be prime. It's going to be a composite number. So our answer is C. 1 and 2 together give us a yes to the question. Okay. Question was, how am I so sure that it's not 3 times some other multiple of 3? I'm not sure at all. Right. Sorry, normally I'd be writing, but I'm new to this this format, so I don't have a pen tool. If I have A as a multiple of 3, I would say, okay, A could be 6, A could be 9, A could be 12. But anytime then I multiply, I add another multiple of 3 to it, I'm going to get a composite number again. So let's say I make A 33. Okay. B could be 6 or 12 or 18. So 33 plus 6, right, is 39. That's not prime. 33 plus 12 is 45. That's not prime. And from number theory, we can know that if you add any 2 multiples of 3, you'll get another multiple of 3. That's how that works, because you can undistribute. You can pull a 3 out of the terms, right? So I have 3 times x plus 3 times 2 times y. You can pull the 3 out, and you have 3 times some integer. Right? And that's how I would see it. Right. So in fact, yeah, you could even type that out. Oh, I see. Peterson has done that exact thing, right? You're saying, hey, I've got 3 times blah 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 equals my number, and so therefore it's not prime. Okay. Are we clear on this one? If so, we'll build up to the more annoying ones. Okay. So now, if we look at another variation of this, we'll look at how this brings in a little bit more of what the question had. And my point is not necessarily that when you do a problem that you find difficult, you want to find 17 different versions of it somewhere online, although certainly you can do that. But I think some people are too reluctant to do that. I'll have a lot of students, I'll say, hey, let's study this whole topic repeatedly. Hey, if you're having trouble with divisibility, do a set of 5 or 10 divisibility problems. And they'll say, yeah, but that's so easy. I know they're all about divisibility and that's taking out part of the challenge. Yes, it is. But my goal in practicing is not to challenge myself. My goal is to learn. My goal is to get faster and better. And so I don't need to assess whether I understand divisibility at that time. I need to increase my understanding of divisibility. So doing things topically is very important. I think one of the top 5 mistakes that people make in studying is that they go too random. I see all these students who say, okay, every day, I go and find, 20 problems to do across this and this, and I do all of them. And they're doing a lot of random study. Or they have the official guide and they go onto the Wiley online tool for the official guide, and they just do, I just do a set of 10 hard problems, and they're doing things very randomly, which is great to do, the week before your test. But it's not great to do a month or more before your test. You want to be doing things more systematically and going by topic and saying, how are these tested? Here's another problem that is asking the same thing in a different way. It's still saying, can K be expressed as a product of 2 integers, each of which is greater than 1? So this is again code for, is K a composite number? Now, if I look at statement 1, it tells me that K is greater than 4 factorial. So it introduces what we saw in the previous problem, the original problem, you could say, which is a factorial. So first off, let's make sure we're clear on what a factorial is. How much is 4 factorial? Are we cozy with, I'm assuming a lot of you are cozy with factorials. What is 4 factorial? It's 24, just 4 times 3 times 2 times 1, right? So we can look at that and say, all right, well, I know that that's just saying K is greater than something. Is that going to tell me whether it's prime? If I know a number is greater than 24, do I know if it's prime? I think we could quickly verify that we don't know. I'm hoping a lot of you know that the primes keep going and going and going, and that's an ongoing area of mathematical research. What's the largest prime we can name? But it's very large. I'll just put it that way. I could not spit that one out for you. The primes seem to keep going and keep going and keep going, and they're distributed in some very interesting ways. But you can always find more primes. So we don't know just from knowing that something's bigger that it's prime or not prime. In fact, this is a quick way of narrowing down our answers, because knowing that a number is greater than something would never tell me anything about whether it's prime. And so I can immediately then say, hey, that's not sufficient. Whereas I look at statement 2 and they give me a range. And I can simply test. I could say, well, let's see. I've got some even numbers in here, 84, 86, 88. Well, those aren't prime. Those are composite, because even numbers after 2 are always composite. And then I have some odd numbers, 85, 87. Is either of those prime? No, 85 is a multiple of 5. How would I test 87 if I don't happen to know offhand? What would I do? Often if something's not even, I'll test for divisibility by 3. And you can see 87 2 ways. One rule is that if the digits add up to a multiple of 3, it's a multiple of 3. So 8 plus 7, right, is 15. So it's a multiple of 3. You could also see that 87 is 3 less than 90. So by the same rule that we saw in the last problem, that if I add a multiple of 3 to another multiple of 3, I get an additional multiple of 3. If 87 is 90 minus 3, then it's a multiple of 3 minus a multiple of 3. It is itself a multiple of 3. So I'm not saying that I know the number is 87. I'm just saying that there are no numbers in this range that are prime, right? So my even numbers, 84, 86, 88, are not prime because they're even multiples of 2, right? They're numbers greater than 2 that are even, right? And then 85 and 87, neither of those are prime. 85 is a multiple of 5, 87 is a multiple of 3. I'm done. So now I know that X is composite again. There are no primes in this range. So what this problem does to make things a little sneakier is it expresses itself differently. And then it gives us a range to deal with instead of simply telling us what we're adding or what we're working with. So we have to think about testing the numbers in that range and narrowing them down. Okay. So now let's get to the original annoying problem that we did. Let me put that back up. Okay. So a couple things this problem does to be a bit more annoying. One, it talks about having a factor p such that 1 is less than p is less than k. If you let that throw you, or you're sitting there going, what is p? What are we talking about p? You're going to get overwhelmed very quickly. If instead you simply say, oh, k is the number we're being asked about. They're asking if it has a factor between itself and 1. Oh, look, this is once again code for is this number composite, right? If k is prime, like if k, for instance, were 5, then it wouldn't have any factors less than it and greater than 1. 5's only factors are 5 and 1. And if it were a large prime, like 29, same thing. All the numbers between 1 and 29 don't go into 29. Only 1 and 29 do. So primes would give you a no to this. Any composite number will give you a yes. If your number is 24 or 36 or 48 or 72 or whatever it is, then those numbers are all going to have a factor less than themselves and greater than 1. Okay. Still, though, we can do the same thing as before on statement 1. K is greater than 4 factorial. I don't care about that at all. Not by itself, right? Statement 1 is useless to me. I'm going to say, AD is out. Now I look at statement 2. What on earth is this? Notice what this has in common with the last one we did. It gives us a range. And it gives us a range that we could test. But the problem is that these are numbers I don't want to deal with. Maybe some of you are math savants who feel very comfortable with adding 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, etc. to 13 factorial. I don't really know what 13 factorial is. I know how to write it: 13 times 12 times 11 times 10. But if any of you actually know the value of 13 factorial, I'm very impressed. But we don't need to know that, right? We don't need to know what 13 factorial is. Instead, we simply have to say, what do I know about this number? I've got a range that I can no longer practically test. So I might start looking at the edges. Notice this is an inclusive range, right? They have a little less than or equal to signs. So k can be 13 factorial plus 2. So how would I know whether 13 factorial plus 2 is prime or composite? How would I assess that? So what about 13 factorial itself? 13 factorial can't be prime, of course, because it's built of all these pieces. 13 factorial is 13 times 12 times 11 times 10 times 9. And I see some of you saying, okay, so, oh yeah, Adrian says we'll know this number is even, right? So 13 factorial is 13 times 12 times all the numbers all the way down. So it's even because it's got multiples of 2 in it, right? And what if you're saying, oh yeah, in fact, it's a multiple of 100, right? Because it has a 10 and a 5 and another 2, many other 2's in it. So it's a multiple of 100. One way or the other, you could see that the 13 factorial will be an even number. When I add 2, I'll get another even number. So, okay, 13 factorial plus 2, check, that's composite. Okay, what about 13 factorial plus 3? Oh, well, 3 is a multiple of 3, of course, and 13 factorial is a multiple of 3. So I'm putting those things together. 13 factorial plus 4, well, let's see. Does 13 factorial have a 4 in it? Yes, it does. Add a multiple of 4 to it. And I can go on and on and on. So I see someone saying plus 7 and plus 11 need to be checked. Well, 13 factorial has all the numbers in it from 2 all the way up to 13, right? So we don't have to check any of them individually, actually, because what we can say is that each of the numbers we add, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5, etc., will be represented inside the number. And so we know that all those things are multiples, right? Now, we can't automatically prove, maybe some of you already know the answer, we can't automatically prove to Jaideep's question whether 13 factorial plus 1 is prime or not. What we can say about 13 factorial plus 1 without any further investigation is that it won't be a multiple of any of the things other than 1 in 13 factorial. In other words, when you take any factorial, 13 factorial, 5 factorial, 100 factorial, whatever it is, you take any factorial and you add 1. Now look at the pieces of that. So we'll use the one that we have, 13 factorial. 13 factorial is a multiple of 13 and of 12 and of 11 and of all the combinations of those pieces. If you add 1 to it, it's no longer a multiple of any of those things. Because when you say, okay, it's a multiple of 100 plus 1, now it's not a multiple of 100 anymore. It's a multiple of 13 plus 1. It's not a multiple of 13 anymore. So that doesn't automatically prove that 13 factorial plus 1 is prime, but it proves that it's not a multiple of any of the things in there. Thankfully, we don't have to assess that since 13 factorial plus 1 is out of our range, but that would be different. Similarly, we could look at 13 factorial plus 14. That would still be okay because I know I have a 7 and a 2 in my range, and so that would still be a composite number. But if we got to a larger prime, like 13 factorial plus 19, I would have to know what this number is to tell. I'd have to know whether 13 factorial is a multiple of 19. Well, of course, I know it isn't one, right? But I'd have to see what happens when I add that number in, right? Okay, so what we can see in this range is that whatever number I have in this range, 2 plus a 13 factorial, 3 plus a 13 factorial, 4 plus, 5 plus, it'll always be a composite number. So our answer is just B. So what I hope you can see from this set of problems is if this is the hardest one of the set, which I think it is this a magic 750 level question that tests some kind of thing that you only learn if you were a math major? No, right? It isn't. It's using all the same pieces as easier questions use. It's simply assembling them, and it's very similar to, I think, to what we saw in sentence correction, where there was no one part of that tulipomania problem that was particularly terrible, right? There was a sentence core, there was a list of parallel terms, there was closing out a list using the and, there was a noun modifier. No one part of it was bad, but put together, it was very bad. Put together, it was a problem that most people miss. And the same thing here. You put these pieces together and it's a problem that most people miss. And it's a problem that some people should miss. And all I mean by that is, if you look at this problem and you don't really know about factorials, you should skip the problem, right? If you look at the problem and you don't know what they're asking and you don't know what they mean by does this have a factor p such that 1 is less than p is less than k, you should skip the problem. But if you're going to do the problem and you're going to get it right, it's really a matter of having these pieces put together so no one part of it is that hard. So when I look at statement 2, I don't find it hard. And it's not because I'm so clever, right? It's not because I'm smarter than the next person. It's simply because I've seen that before. And you may feel the same way. Some of you who are very comfortable with math, but who are also humble, might say, look, I'm not doing well at math because I'm the smartest person in the world. Maybe you are, right? But I'm not doing it that. It's because I have experience. I've seen these things before. And a lot of times it's recognizing certain scenarios and saying, oh yeah, it's one of those ones where there's a factorial and there's a range, and the GMAT tests that sometimes. So on the one hand, I might seem to be contradicting myself. Earlier with sentence correction, I was saying you don't want to have a long list of cases to memorize. It's much more about the individual building blocks. And I think that's still true. And that's true to a large extent with quant. If you understand factorials, if you understand prime numbers, if you understand the way that those are presented to you, you're going to have most of what you need to get this problem. But additionally, if you're so comfortable with this, that you can now recognize the setup they're giving you without a lot of work, without a lot of need to test numbers, then this problem that might otherwise be forbidding becomes much easier. Okay. So I know I haven't given anyone the magic keys to get a 750 overnight. Those keys don't exist that I know of unless you have some way to cheat. But I hope that you have gotten some ideas about what it looks like to perform at this level. And it's not so much about doing everything right or memorizing everything or seeing every problem it is. I think it's much more about learning well from what you have. And what I'd suggest is that this has a lot to do with the way that we study. Right? If you look at how a lot of people are studying, they're just doing one problem after another after another. But if you can follow up your practice test mode, your time behavior with untimed behavior, where you go through it again, you analyze, you pull it apart. And again, I recommend that you do this analysis before you actually find out whether you were right or wrong. I think you'll do much better. And then look for connections. If you're studying divisibility, if you're studying parallelism, if you're studying assumptions, do problems in sets together where you're looking at what are the traits here? What do these have in common? I had a student who was struggling with exponent problems. And he was kind of annoyed because he said, look, I know how to do exponents. I know the rules. And I said, all right, so I wonder why you're missing them. Let's look at some problems. And he said, well, yeah, but they're all different, aren't they? And we looked at about 4 problems that he'd had trouble with. And they weren't all different. They were basically testing 2 things. Between those 4 problems, there were 2 things over and over again that he needed to be more competent with. And I think we find that again and again, that there may be just a few things that we really need to be better at to be much more confident in an area. And so take that study mode time seriously. A lot of people will tell me that if they do a time set of 5 problems in 10 minutes for quant, that it takes them an hour to study those thoroughly. I think it's worth it. So go in there, discuss, go on the forums, look at explanations, explain it to yourself first though. Make sure that you have the best feel for it, and don't settle. If you got it right, don't just say, oh, great, I got it right. Don't find out. Look at it and say, hey, I think the answer is B. I think the answer is A, whatever it is. How do I prove it? Is there a faster way? Is there an easier way? I'm always looking for an easier way. I don't settle for, yes, I have now proven that X equals 20. I always want to say, can I do it 10% faster? Can I do it with more confidence? Can I do it with less confusion? Right? That's a big part of getting better. It's much more about that than about endlessly, working on the hardest combinatorics problems and things like that. I had a student get a perfect 51 in quant, and he said, I don't know how to do combinatorics. I've never studied it. Maybe he's an outlier, but my point is there's no one obscure topic you need to get really good at to get a high score in the GMAT. It's much more about learning the same things everyone else is learning and getting very consistent in your process and knowing how they're connected. Okay. So I will stop there, but I would love to open it up to questions if people have questions about any of this. I'll land us on the promo slide for our admissions course. So if you want to check out our admissions series, you can do that. Let's see. Here we go. But questions for me? All right, everybody. Well, I hope you found this helpful. Best of luck with your whole journey with this. I hope to see you around GMAT Club. I tend to post a lot on sentence correction. Find that's a good place to have conversations. So check me out on there, and I hope to see everyone around. But best of luck getting to that number, and hope everything goes well for you. Thanks so much for tuning in.